The thunder of hooves echoed across the plains as Owen Ingram raced back to Red Cloud, Nebraska, his heart pounding faster than his stallion's gallop. The year was 1879, and everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, was about to collapse into the darkest hole he'd ever faced, one deeper than any silver mine in the territory. Owen's sorrel horse, Rusty, snorted with effort as they crested the final hill overlooking the town. Red Cloud had grown considerably since Owen had first arrived 5 years ago. What had once been little more than a trading post along the Republican River had transformed into a proper frontier settlement with a main street, a general store, a saloon, and even a small schoolhouse. The railroad had brought prosperity, and the nearby silver mines had brought men like Owen dreamers with calloused hands and iron determination. The mid-April sun beat down on Owen's back as he steered Rusty toward the doctor's office at the edge of town. Doc Harris was waiting outside, wiping his hands on a cloth that was stained with something Owen didn't want to identify. "How bad is it?" Owen asked, swinging down from the saddle, his boots kicking up dust as they hit the ground. Doc Harris, a man who had seen everything from gunshot wounds to childbirth, shook his head grimly. "Cave-in at the Silver Creek mine. 3 dead, 7 injured. Your brother's still trapped, Owen. They're working to get to him now." Owen's blood ran cold. James, his younger brother by 2 years, had only joined him at the mine 6 months ago, leaving behind their failing family farm in Ohio after their parents passed. Owen had promised to look after him. "I need to get back there," Owen said, already turning toward Rusty. "Wait." The doctor gripped Owen's arm. "There's more." The rescue crew heard tapping. They think James is alive, but they don't know how badly he's hurt. Hope and dread warred in Owen's chest as he mounted Rusty again. He pushed the horse hard on the return journey to the Silver Creek mine, where a crowd had gathered at the entrance. Foreman Marshall was organizing men into rescue teams, his face streaked with soot and worry. "Ingram," Marshall acknowledged. "We're getting closer." "The tapping stopped about 10 minutes ago, but we've cleared most of the debris. Should reach the pocket where we think your brother is within the hour." Owen didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a pickaxe and joined the rescue crew, hacking at fallen rock and timber with desperate strength. The hours blurred together as they dug, the air thick with dust and fear. When they finally broke through to the small pocket of space where James lay, Owen was the first to crawl through. "James," Owen called, his voice breaking at the sight of his brother's still form. In the dim light of a lantern, he could see James was breathing, but his face was covered in blood from a gash on his forehead. "James, it's Owen. We've got you." James's eyes fluttered open, but there was something wrong with his gaze. It was unfocused, confused. When Owen spoke again, James showed no recognition of his voice. "Something's wrong," Owen said as they carefully moved James onto a stretcher. "He can see me, but it's like he doesn't hear me." The journey back to town was agonizing, with James drifting in and out of consciousness. By the time they reached Doc Harris's office, night had fallen, and the doctor's oil lamps cast long shadows across the walls as he examined James. "The blow to his head is serious but not fatal," Doc Harris said after a thorough examination. "But I'm concerned about his hearing. The blast and cave-in, the pressure could have damaged his eardrums." "What are you saying?" Owen demanded. "I'm saying your brother might be deaf, Owen. The tests I've done show no response to sound. It could be temporary, but—" The doctor's voice trailed off, and Owen knew what he wasn't saying. It could be permanent. The days that followed confirmed the worst. James couldn't hear not Owen's voice, not the sound of the doctor's instruments, not the church bells that rang every Sunday morning. The mine company offered compensation a pittance. Riley and Owen used it to secure a small homestead outside of town. He couldn't bring himself to return to the mine, not after what it had taken from James. Instead, he threw himself into building a life where he could take care of his brother. Summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to a bitter winter. James learned to lip read with remarkable speed, his intelligence undimmed by his disability. But he withdrew into himself, the vibrant young man who had arrived in Red Cloud with dreams of fortune, now a shadow who rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of their property. Owen watched helplessly as his brother drifted further away, consumed by guilt that he had encouraged James to join him at the mine. The weight of that decision hung over the homestead like a shroud, muffling whatever joy might have taken root there. Spring arrived with sudden warmth in 1880, and with it came a letter from back east. A teacher for the deaf was coming to Red Cloud, funded by some church organization with more money than sense, according to the gossips at the general store. Owen didn't pay much attention to the news until Marshall, now working as the town's postmaster, handed him a letter addressed specifically to James. "Teacher wants to meet with anyone affected by hearing loss," Marshall explained. "Town council thought of your brother straight away." Owen took the letter home, watching as James read it with the first spark of interest he'd shown in months. They would go, James insisted, his hands moving in the rudimentary signs they had developed between themselves. Owen couldn't deny him. The schoolhouse had been transformed when they arrived the following week. Charts and diagrams covered the walls, and a small group of people, mostly children and their parents, sat in a semicircle facing a woman who stood by the blackboard. Owen's first impression of Lillian Turner was that she seemed too delicate for the frontier. She was tall but slender, with auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and a dress that, while plain, was clearly of Eastern manufacture. But when she turned to greet the newcomers, Owen was struck by the strength in her gaze's deep brown eyes that assessed James and himself with intelligence and compassion. "Welcome," she said, her voice clear and her hands moving in unfamiliar patterns as she spoke. "I'm Miss Turner. Please join us." James stepped forward with more confidence than Owen had seen since the accident, taking a seat near the front. Owen remained standing at the back, arms crossed, uncertain of his place in this strange gathering. Miss Turner began her lesson, speaking and signing simultaneously. The children watched her hands with rapt attention, occasionally mimicking her movements. Parents looked on with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. Owen found himself watching Miss Turner's face, the animation in her expressions, the way she seemed to communicate as much with her eyes as with her words or hands. After the lesson, as people began to disperse, Miss Turner approached James directly. "Mr. Ingram," she said, her hands moving in those same patterns. "I'm very pleased you could come today." James looked to Owen, who stepped forward to interpret, but Miss Turner produced a small slate and chalk from her bag. She wrote quickly and handed it to James. "I would like to teach you proper sign language. It will give you back the world of communication you've lost." James read the message, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious interest. He took the chalk and wrote back, "Why would you help me?" "I'm just a miner who got careless." Miss Turner's response was immediate. "No one is just anything, Mr. Ingram, and from what I understand, you were a victim of circumstance, not carelessness." Owen watched this exchange with growing unease. There was something about the way Miss Turner looked at James with respect, not pity, that made him feel suddenly superfluous. For months, he had been James's connection to the world, interpreting, protecting, deciding. What would happen if James no longer needed that? "My brother and I appreciate your interest, Miss Turner," Owen said stiffly, "but we manage well enough on our own." Miss Turner turned those penetrating eyes on Owen. "Mr. Ingram, I presume, your brother has lost his hearing, not his right to choose his own path." Her tone was polite but firm. "Perhaps you might ask him what he wants." James was already writing on the slate. "I would like to learn. When can we begin?" And so began a transformation that Owen observed with a mixture of joy and trepidation. 3 times a week, James traveled into town for lessons with Miss Turner. He returned each time with new signs to teach Owen, his hands flying in increasingly complex patterns as he described his day. Miss Turner had given him books on lip reading techniques, on the deaf schools in the East, on famous deaf individuals who had made significant contributions to society. She says I should consider teaching someday, James signed one evening as they sat on the porch. That children here need someone who understands their experience. Owen nodded, trying to hide his discomfort. Seems like a lot of change in a short time. James studied his brother's face with the intensity that had become characteristic since losing his hearing. You're not happy about this, he signed. I want whatever makes you happy, Owen replied truthfully. I just worry about you building up hopes that might not be realistic out here. Red Cloud isn't exactly Washington, D.C. Miss Turner says change has to start somewhere, James countered. Why not here, why not indeed, Owen thought as he rode into town alone the following Saturday. James was at home, absorbed in one of Miss Turner's books, and Owen had volunteered to pick up supplies and perhaps have a word with the teacher who was filling his brother's head with such grand ideas. He found Miss Turner at the boarding house where she was staying, seated on the front porch with a stack of papers in her lap. She looked up as Owen approached, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Mr. Ingram," she greeted him, "is James all right?" "James is fine," Owen said, removing his hat. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Miss Turner gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Of course." Owen sat, placing his hat on his knee, suddenly unsure how to begin. "My brother thinks very highly of you," he said finally. "The feeling is mutual. James is remarkably intelligent and determined." "Yes, he is. That's why I'm concerned about these ideas you're giving him about teaching, about going east to some special school. He's still recovering from a traumatic experience." Miss Turner set her papers aside, giving Owen her full attention. "Mr. Ingram, your brother lost his hearing, not his potential. From what I can tell, he spent the past year recovering not just from physical trauma, but from the belief that his life is effectively over." "I never said his life was over," Owen protested. "Perhaps not in words," she replied gently. "But by treating him as someone to be protected rather than supported, you've sent that message nonetheless." The accusation stung because Owen recognized its truth. He had been so focused on protecting James from further harm that he hadn't considered what his brother might still achieve. "I only want what's best for him," Owen said, his voice rougher than he intended. "As do I," Miss Turner responded. "And what's best is allowing him to discover his own path forward. The world doesn't end with deafness, Mr. Ingram. It simply changes." Owen studied her as she spoke, noting the passion in her voice, the conviction in her eyes. "You seem very certain of that." "I am." She hesitated, then added, "My younger sister lost her hearing to scarlet fever when she was 12. I watched her struggle against not just her disability, but the limitations others placed on her. That's why I do this work." The personal revelation softened Owen's defensiveness. "I didn't know." "How could you? We haven't exactly had a proper conversation until now." Her smile was brief but genuine. "James speaks very highly of you too, you know. He understands that everything you've done has been out of love." Owen looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "I should get back to him." "He's waiting for supplies." Miss Turner nodded, but as Owen stood to leave, she said, "Mr. Ingram, perhaps you could join James for a lesson sometime. It might help you both." Owen didn't commit to an answer, but the invitation lingered in his mind as he completed his errands and rode home. James was waiting on the porch, eager for news from town and the package of books Owen had collected from the post office. "Did you see Miss Turner?" James signed after taking the books. Owen nodded. "Briefly. She suggested I might join you for a lesson sometime." James's face lit up. "You should. She's an excellent teacher." "Maybe," Owen conceded, not wanting to dampen his brother's enthusiasm. "We'll see." That night, Owen lay awake longer than usual, replaying his conversation with Miss Turner. Her words about allowing James to find his own path forward resonated uncomfortably. Had he been holding his brother back out of some misguided sense of protection? Or was it something else entirely, a selfish desire to keep James dependent on him, to assuage his own guilt over the accident? The questions followed Owen into an uneasy sleep and were still with him when he woke at dawn. The day promised to be fair, so he decided to work on repairing the corral fence, a task that required enough physical exertion to keep his mind occupied. James joined him after breakfast, and they worked side by side in companionable silence for several hours. As they paused for water, James tapped Owen's shoulder to get his attention. "I've been thinking," he signed. "Miss Turner mentioned that the church is looking for someone to help with repairs." "I could do that," Owen frowned. "You want to be a handyman, I want to be useful," James signed emphatically, "to earn my own way." "You are useful here," Owen protested, "and you don't need to earn your way with me, we're family." "I know that," James replied. "But I need more than just chores around our property. I need purpose, Owen." The sincerity in James's expression made it impossible for Owen to argue further. "All right," he conceded. "If that's what you want, I'll speak to Reverend Collins tomorrow." James's smile was worth the discomfort Owen felt at the idea of his brother working independently in town. They returned to their fence repairs, but Owen's thoughts remained on his brother's request and what it revealed about the gap between James's needs and Owen's perception of them. The next day, Owen rode into town alone to speak with Reverend Collins. The Reverend was enthusiastic about James's offer of help, mentioning several projects around the church that had been neglected due to lack of funds and manpower. Owen found himself describing James's skills in carpentry and mechanics, surprised by his own pride as the Reverend nodded approvingly. On his way back to his horse, Owen paused outside the schoolhouse where Miss Turner was conducting another lesson. Through the window, he could see her demonstrating signs to a group of children and their parents. Her movements were graceful and precise, her expression animated as she encouraged her students to copy her. As if sensing his presence, Miss Turner glanced toward the window. Their eyes met briefly before Owen looked away, embarrassed to be caught watching. He hurried to his horse and rode home, pushing thoughts of Miss Turner aside to focus on sharing the good news with James. James began working at the church the following week, starting with simple repairs to the steps and railings. Owen worried constantly at first, checking on him several times a day until James firmly signed that he didn't need supervision. Reluctantly, Owen returned to their homestead, channeling his anxiety into expanding their vegetable garden and building a new hen house. To Owen's surprise, James thrived in his new role. Reverend Collins paid him a fair wage, and the church congregation accepted him readily, many taking the time to learn basic signs from the charts Miss Turner had provided. James returned home each evening tired but satisfied, his confidence growing visibly with each passing day. "Miss Turner asked about you today," James signed one evening as they ate supper. "She wondered why you haven't attended any lessons." Owen focused intently on cutting his beef. "I've been busy here. Besides, the lessons are for you, not me." "They're for anyone who wants to communicate with the deaf," James countered. "Several people from town have started attending just to learn. Even old Mrs. Whittaker comes, and you know how she feels about new ideas." Owen couldn't help but smile at the mention of the town's most notorious conservative. "Mrs. Whittaker is learning sign language," James nodded. "She says it's never too late to learn something useful. She has a cousin back east who lost her hearing in old age." The revelation that others in town were making more effort to communicate with James than he himself was lately sent a wave of shame through Owen. "Maybe I will come to the next lesson," he said finally. James's expression brightened. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. "I'll be there after I finish at the church." Owen kept his word, arriving at the schoolhouse just as the lesson was beginning. Miss Turner's surprise at seeing him quickly gave way to a warm welcome as she directed him to an empty seat next to James. The lesson focused on everyday phrases, greetings, questions about well-being, expressions of basic needs. Owen watched carefully as Miss Turner demonstrated each sign, then practiced alongside the other students. "Very good, Mr. Ingram. Miss Turner said when she came around to observe their practice. "You have a natural aptitude for this." Owen felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at her praise. "James and I already use some signs. They're not proper ones, just things we made up, but they work for us." "Home signs are common and often quite ingenious," she replied. "Perhaps you could show me sometime. They might be worth incorporating into our local vocabulary." After the lesson, as the other students filtered out, James became engaged in conversation with Reverend Collins about the church repairs, leaving Owen momentarily alone with Miss Turner. "I'm glad you came today," she said as she gathered her teaching materials. "It means a great deal to James." "I should have come sooner," Owen admitted. "I can see now how important this is." Miss Turner studied him thoughtfully. "It's never easy to adjust when someone we love changes, even when that change is ultimately positive." "I'm not sure what you mean," Owen said, though he suspected he did. "I mean that you and James are both finding your way after the accident. His path is becoming clearer to him, but perhaps yours is still uncertain." The insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. Before the accident, Owen had been a miner with dreams of striking it rich. After, he had become his brother's caretaker and protector. Now that James was reclaiming his independence, Owen wasn't sure what role remained for him. "I'm managing well enough," Owen said, more curtly than he intended. Miss Turner didn't take offense. "Of course you are. I merely wanted to acknowledge that change can be difficult, even necessary change." She picked up her satchel. "I'm walking toward the general store if you'd care to join me." The invitation was casual, but something in Miss Turner's eyes suggested a genuine desire for his company. Owen hesitated, glancing at James, who was still deep in conversation with the Reverend. "I should wait for my brother," Owen began, but James looked up just then, catching his eye. With a knowing smile, James signed, "Go ahead, I'll be a while here." Left without an excuse, Owen turned back to Miss Turner. "I'd be happy to walk with you." They strolled down the main street of Red Cloud, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows as they went. Miss Turner inquired about Owen's homestead, listening with genuine interest as he described the improvements he'd made over the past year. "It sounds lovely," she said. "A true home." "It's nothing fancy," Owen replied, suddenly self-conscious about the modesty of his achievements compared to her educated background. "Just a place to lay our heads. A home isn't defined by its grandeur, Mr. Ingram, but by the care with which it's built and maintained." Her smile was warm. "From what you describe, you've created something worthwhile." Owen found himself unexpectedly touched by her assessment. "Thank you, Miss Turner." "Lillian," she corrected gently. "If we're to be friends, you might as well use my given name." "Lillian," Owen repeated, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "Then I'm Owen." They reached the general store where Lillian needed to purchase supplies for her lessons. Owen waited as she selected paper, pencils, and a book of illustrated stories for her youngest students. As they left the store, Owen impulsively offered to carry her packages. "Thank you, Owen," she said, relinquishing the parcels. "That's very kind." "It's nothing," he demurred, though he felt a peculiar satisfaction at being of service to her. They walked more slowly on the return journey, their conversation shifting to Lillian's background. She had been born in Boston to a merchant family, educated at a women's seminary, and had discovered her calling after her sister's illness led her to learn sign language. "I taught at a school for the deaf in New York for 3 years," she explained. "But I felt called to bring these skills to places with fewer resources. When the Church Society offered to sponsor a teacher in the Western Territories, I volunteered immediately." "That was brave," Owen observed. "Many Eastern women wouldn't consider such a journey." "Perhaps," Lillian acknowledged, "but I've never regretted it. There's important work to be done here." They had reached the schoolhouse again, where James was just emerging with Reverend Collins. James's expression when he saw them together was one of such obvious pleasure that Owen felt his ears grow warm. "I should get back to my brother," Owen said, handing the packages back to Lillian. "Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for attending the lesson," she replied. "I hope you'll come again." Owen did return, not just for the next lesson but for several after that. He discovered that he enjoyed learning the formal signs, appreciating the structure and logic behind the language. More than that, he enjoyed watching Lillian teach her patience, her expressiveness, her genuine delight when a student mastered a difficult concept. As spring deepened into summer, Owen found himself inventing reasons to visit town more frequently. He would offer to deliver James to his work at the church, then linger to help with repairs himself. He would volunteer to collect supplies, timing his visits to coincide with Lillian's lunch hour, which she often took on a bench outside the schoolhouse. James observed these developments with silent amusement, occasionally teasing Owen with signs that only the two of them understood. Owen would brush off the teasing, but privately, he couldn't deny that his interest in Lillian Turner had grown beyond respect for her as James's teacher. He wasn't the only one interested, however. Lillian's position in the community, her education, and her undeniable beauty had attracted the attention of several eligible men in Red Cloud. The banker's son, a smooth-talking Easterner with polished boots and a gold watch chain, was particularly persistent, calling at her boarding house with flowers and invitations to supper. Owen told himself it was none of his concern. Lillian was free to keep whatever company she chose. Yet he couldn't help the surge of jealousy he felt when he saw her walking down the street with the banker's son, her head tilted attentively as he spoke. "Why don't you just tell her how you feel?" James signed one evening after Owen had spent an hour chopping firewood they didn't need, working out his frustration through physical labor. "There's nothing to tell," Owen replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Miss Turner is a fine woman doing important work here, that's all." James rolled his eyes expressively. "You're a terrible liar, brother," Owen sighed, setting down his axe. "What would I even say to her? She's educated, cultured. I'm just a former miner who barely finished schooling." "You're also kind, hardworking, and loyal," James countered. "Those qualities matter more than fancy words." Owen wasn't convinced, but James's vote of confidence stayed with him through the night and into the next day, when he rode into town with a load of vegetables from their garden to sell at the market. He hadn't planned to see Lillian, but as he was loading his empty crates back onto his wagon, he spotted her emerging from the general store. She was alone, and before he could second-guess himself, Owen raised a hand in greeting. Lillian smiled when she saw him, changing direction to approach his wagon. "Good morning, Owen. A successful market day." "Successful enough," he replied, suddenly self-conscious of his work clothes and the dirt under his fingernails. "How are your lessons progressing?" "Wonderfully. We have 3 new students, a family that just moved here from Kansas City. Their youngest daughter was born deaf." Lillian's eyes shone with enthusiasm as she described the little girl's quick uptake of sign language. Owen found himself captivated not by the story itself, but by the passion with which Lillian told it. When she paused for breath, he blurted, "Would you like to come to dinner at our homestead? James has been wanting to thank you properly for all you've done, and I'd like to show you the place." The invitation hung between them, and for a moment Owen feared he had overstepped, but then Lillian's smile widened. "I'd like that very much," she said. "When would be convenient?" They settled on the following Sunday after church, and Owen rode home with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. The next few days were a flurry of preparation, as Owen and James worked to make their modest home presentable for a lady's visit. They cleaned until every surface shone, arranged wildflowers in a jar for the table, and debated endlessly about what to serve for the meal. "She's not coming for the food," James signed in exasperation after Owen discarded his 3rd menu plan. "She's coming to spend time with us." "With you," Owen corrected. "She's your teacher." James gave him a look that clearly communicated disbelief. "If you believe that, you're even more oblivious than I thought." Sunday arrived clear and warm. Owen drove the wagon into town to attend church services, something he had neglected in the months after the accident, but had resumed recently. He sat in a back pew, his gaze repeatedly drawn to where Lillian sat near the front, her posture perfect, her attention fixed on Reverend Collins as he delivered his sermon. After the service, Owen approached her with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Are you ready to see our humble abode?" he asked, offering his arm in a gesture that felt both foreign and right. "I've been looking forward to it all week," Lillian replied, placing her hand lightly on his arm. James joined them, his smile knowing as he signed, "I'll ride with Reverend Collins. He wants to discuss the new pulpit design." Owen started to protest, but James was already walking away, leaving him alone with Lillian. With no alternative, Owen helped her into the wagon, acutely aware of the warmth of her hand in his as he assisted her. The ride to the homestead was filled with easy conversation. Lillian asked questions about the land they passed, listening intently as Owen described the challenges and rewards of farming in the Nebraska territory. By the time they arrived at the property, Owen's initial nervousness had faded, replaced by a quiet pleasure in her company. "This is lovely," Lillian exclaimed as the homestead came into view. The house was small but solidly built, with a newly painted porch and window boxes filled with geraniums that James tended religiously. The barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond them stretched fields of corn and wheat ripening in the summer sun. "It's a work in progress," Owen said modestly, though pride colored his voice. "James and I built most of it ourselves over the past year." "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time," Lillian observed as Owen helped her down from the wagon. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area and two small bedrooms off to one side. Owen had set the table with their best dishes mismatched, but clean, and the wildflowers added a touch of color to the rustic setting. "Please, make yourself at home," Owen said, suddenly aware of how plain everything must seem to someone accustomed to Eastern comforts. But Lillian moved through the space with genuine appreciation, admiring the hand-carved shelves that held their few books, the pieced quilt that covered the back of the sofa, the curtains James had insisted on sewing to make the place civilized. "You've created a true home here," she said, echoing her words from weeks ago. "It's wonderful to see it in person." Owen felt a flush of pleasure at her approval. "It's nothing fancy, but it suits us." James arrived shortly after, bringing with him a palpable energy that filled the small house. He signed rapidly to Lillian, describing his plans for the church pulpit and asking her opinion on several design elements. She responded in kind, her hands moving with the same grace that had first caught Owen's attention. Owen busied himself with preparing their meal, a stew he had started early that morning, fresh bread from the town baker. He had decided not to risk his own inconsistent baking, and a berry cobbler for dessert. As he worked, he found himself watching Lillian and James together, struck by the easy camaraderie between them. There was nothing of the formal teacher-student relationship in their interaction now. They were simply two people communicating in a language that connected them, sharing jokes and stories with expressive faces and flying hands. Owen felt a momentary pang of exclusion, reminded of how much had changed since the accident. But then Lillian looked up, catching his eye across the room, and smiled with such warmth that the feeling dissipated like morning mist. She excused herself from James and came to join Owen by the stove. "Can I help with anything?" she offered. "I'm quite capable in a kitchen, despite what my boarding house landlady might tell you," Owen chuckled. "Mrs. Barton doesn't approve of your cooking." "Mrs. Barton doesn't approve of ladies cooking at all," Lillian replied with a wry smile. "She believes it's a skill best left to those without education, poor woman. But my mother taught all her daughters to manage a household properly, regardless of our schooling." "In that case," Owen said, handing her a wooden spoon, "you can stir the stew while I set out the bread." They worked together comfortably, moving around each other in the small kitchen as if they had done so many times before. James watched them with undisguised satisfaction, signing to Owen when Lillian's back was turned. "See, I told you." The meal was a success, the conversation flowing easily despite the mix of spoken words and sign language. Owen found himself signing more than speaking, drawn into the rhythm of this silent communication that seemed, paradoxically, to allow for deeper connection than mere words. As they ate cobbler, Lillian shared news that she had been holding back. "I've received a letter from the Church Society," she said, her expression carefully neutral. "They're pleased with the progress here and have asked if I would consider extending my stay through the winter and into next spring." "And will you?" James signed, his expression hopeful. Lillian glanced at Owen before answering. "I'm strongly considering it. There's still so much to do here and I've grown attached to Red Cloud." "The town would be fortunate to keep you longer," Owen said, his heart quickening at the prospect of more months with Lillian in Red Cloud. "There are challenges, of course," Lillian continued. "My current lodgings at Mrs. Barton's were only secured through summer, and she's already promised my room to her niece arriving in September." "What will you do?" Owen asked, concerned. "Reverend Collins has suggested the room above the schoolhouse. It's small, but it would serve well enough through winter." James signed something to Lillian that Owen couldn't quite follow, causing her to blush slightly. "That's very kind, James, but I couldn't possibly impose to that extent." Owen looked between them, confused. What did he say? James signed again, more slowly this time, and Owen's ears grew hot as he understood. "You could stay here. We have space and Owen would be happy to have you." "James," Owen admonished, mortified. "Miss Turner, Lillian, please excuse my brother's forwardness." Lillian's blush deepened, but she laughed softly. "There's nothing to excuse. It was kindly meant, I'm sure." She glanced at James, who nodded vigorously. "But I think the schoolhouse room will suit me perfectly." The moment passed, but Owen couldn't stop thinking about James's suggestion as they cleared the table and moved to the porch to enjoy the late afternoon breeze. The idea of Lillian living under their roof was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling, because he would see her daily. Terrifying, because his growing feelings would be impossible to hide in such proximity. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Owen reluctantly acknowledged that it was time to take Lillian back to town. James opted to stay behind, signing that he wanted to sketch some ideas for the church project, but Owen suspected his brother was simply giving them time alone. The drive back was quieter than the journey out, a comfortable silence settling between them as the wagon rolled through the golden evening light. Fireflies began to appear in the growing dusk, their small lights blinking on and off among the tall grasses that lined the road. "Thank you for today," Lillian said eventually. "It was one of the most pleasant Sundays I've spent in Red Cloud." "Thank you for coming," Owen replied. "You brought a brightness to our home that has been missing for some time." The words slipped out before he could measure them, more revealing than he had intended. But Lillian didn't seem to mind. She turned slightly toward him on the seat, her expression thoughtful in the fading light. "May I ask you something personal, Owen?" Owen nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Before the accident, what were your dreams? Not just for yourself, but for your life?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked about his dreams in so long that he had almost forgotten he had them. "I wanted to make enough from the mine to buy good land," he said slowly. "To build a proper farm, raise horses maybe. Eventually find a wife, have a family." He shrugged, embarrassed by the simplicity of his ambitions. "Nothing extraordinary." "On the contrary," Lillian said softly. "Those are the most extraordinary dreams of all, because they're about building a life, not just making a living." Owen glanced at her, struck by the understanding in her eyes. "The accident changed things. After James was injured, I couldn't think beyond making sure he was all right. And now? Now that James is finding his way forward, I'm not sure," Owen admitted. "For so long, I've defined myself by what happened to James, by my responsibility to him. It's hard to see beyond that sometimes. Lillian was quiet for a moment, then said, "Perhaps it's time to reclaim those dreams, Owen." Not exactly as they were, because we all change with experience. But the heart of them, the desire for a full life, for connection and purpose that doesn't need to change. They had reached the edge of town, the lights of houses and businesses glowing warmly in the twilight. Owen slowed the wagon, reluctant to end their conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said weeks ago," he said, gathering his courage. "About how when someone we love changes, we have to find our own path too. You were right." "It's something I learned watching my sister," Lillian replied. "And something I'm still learning myself. Change is the only constant in life, isn't it?" They arrived at Mrs. Barton's boarding house all too soon. Owen helped Lillian down from the wagon, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Would you like to join us for the town picnic next Saturday?" he asked impulsively. "James and I usually attend, and it might be a nice opportunity for you to meet more people from the outlying farms." "I'd like that very much," Lillian said, her smile visible even in the gathering darkness. "Shall I bring something? Just yourself," Owen replied. "That's more than enough." He watched as she climbed the steps to the boarding house, turning once to wave before disappearing inside. The drive home seemed longer without her presence, but Owen's mind was full of their conversation and the possibilities it had awakened. James was waiting on the porch when Owen returned, his expression expectant. "Well," he signed as Owen approached. "Well, what?" Owen replied, feigning ignorance. James made an exasperated sign that needed no translation. "Did you tell her how you feel?" "There's nothing to tell," Owen insisted, though with less conviction than before. "We had a pleasant conversation, that's all." "You're impossible," James signed, but his expression was affectionate rather than truly annoyed. "She likes you, you know, I can tell." Owen wanted to believe his brother, but doubt lingered. Lillian was everything he was not: educated, cultured, at home in the wider world. What could she possibly see in a rough-hewn former miner with dirt perpetually under his fingernails? The week, leading up to the town picnic, passed in a blur of farm work and preparation. Owen found himself paying unusual attention to his appearance as Saturday approached, even going so far as to purchase a new shirt from the general store, an extravagance he would normally have considered frivolous. James teased him mercilessly about these preparations, but Owen could see that his brother was pleased. Since the accident, there had been precious little joy in their lives, just the grinding work of survival and recovery. Now, with James finding new purpose through his work and learning, and Owen cautiously opening himself to new possibilities, the atmosphere in their small home had lightened considerably. The day of the picnic dawned clear and hot, a typical July day in Nebraska. Owen and James arrived early to help set up tables and benches on the grassy area beside the church, where town gatherings were traditionally held. By mid-morning, families began to arrive with baskets of food and blankets for sitting. Children raced across the grass, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze, while adults congregated in small groups, catching up on news and gossip. Owen found himself watching the path from town, unable to concentrate on the conversations around him. When Lillian finally appeared, walking alongside Reverend Collins and his wife, Owen's heart skipped a beat. She wore a simple dress of sky-blue cotton, her hair arranged more casually than usual, with tendrils escaping to frame her face. She looked younger, less the formal teacher and more a woman enjoying a summer day. James noticed Owen's distraction and signed discreetly, "Go to her. I'm fine here with the Millers." Owen needed no further encouragement. He made his way through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping until he reached Lillian's side. "Welcome to the annual Red Cloud torture by heat," he said, earning a laugh from Lillian and a look of mock disapproval from Mrs. Collins. "It's hardly that bad, Mr. Ingram," the Reverend's wife chided. "Why, I remember a picnic 5 years ago when it was so hot the butter melted right off the biscuits before you could get them to your mouth." "All the more reason to claim a spot in the shade," Owen replied, offering his arm to Lillian. "May I show you to where we've set up?" Lillian accepted his arm with a smile, bidding goodbye to the Collins as Owen led her toward a large oak tree at the edge of the gathering, where James was already engaged in animated conversation with the Miller family, using a combination of signs and the slate he carried for communication with those who didn't sign. "Your brother has become quite popular," Lillian observed as they approached. "Mrs. Miller was telling me just yesterday how much her children enjoy learning signs from him." Owen felt a surge of pride. He's always had a way with people. The accident didn't change that, even if it changed how he connects with them. The picnic was a lively affair, with games for the children, a selection of homemade dishes that represented the diverse backgrounds of Red Cloud's residents, and plenty of conversation. Owen introduced Lillian to neighbors from surrounding farms, pleased by how easily she engaged with everyone, from the taciturn Swedish carpenter to the garrulous wife of the blacksmith. As the afternoon wore on, someone produced a fiddle and impromptu dancing began on a flat stretch of ground near the food tables. Owen watched as couples formed for a Virginia reel, feeling a familiar pang at the memory of dances before the accident, when he and James would compete good-naturedly for partners. "Would you like to dance?" Lillian's voice at his elbow startled Owen from his thoughts. "I am not much of a dancer," he admitted, though in truth he had once enjoyed it well enough. "Neither am I," Lillian confessed with a small smile. "But it looks like fun, doesn't it?" Before Owen could respond, a shadow fell across them. It was the banker's son, Edward, impeccably dressed despite the heat and wearing a confident smile. "Miss Turner," he said with a slight bow, "I was hoping you might honor me with a dance." Owen felt his stomach sink as Lillian turned to the newcomer with a polite smile. Of course she would prefer to dance with Edward, who probably knew all the fashionable steps from Boston or New York. But to his surprise, Lillian shook her head. "I'm afraid I've already promised this dance to Mr. Ingram," she said, her hand finding Owen's arm. "Perhaps another time." Edward's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, I'll look forward to it." With a nod to Owen that held a hint of challenge, he retreated. "You didn't have to do that," Owen said quietly once Edward was out of earshot. "I wouldn't have minded if you wanted to dance with him." Lillian turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I didn't do it out of pity or obligation, Owen. I declined because I'd rather dance with you." The simple statement, delivered with such straightforward honesty, left Owen momentarily speechless. In that silence, Lillian's confidence seemed to waver. "Unless you truly don't want to dance, I don't mean to presume, no," Owen interrupted, finding his voice at last. "I mean, yes, I want to dance with you, very much." The smile that bloomed on Lillian's face was worth any amount of awkwardness Owen might feel on the dance floor. He offered his hand, and she took it, allowing him to lead her into the circle of dancers forming for the next reel. The dance was lively, requiring concentration as couples moved through the patterns, but Owen found himself remembering the steps more easily than expected. Lillian followed his lead gracefully, her laughter bubbling up when they occasionally misstepped. Each time the dance brought them back together, Owen felt a growing certainty that something important was happening between them, something he hadn't dared hope for since the day of the mine collapse. From the sidelines, James watched with evident satisfaction, signing enthusiastically to Mrs. Miller, who had learned enough to understand his basic commentary. When the dance ended and Owen led Lillian back toward the shade, James signed, "It's about time," with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. "What did he say?" Lillian asked, noticing the exchange. "Nothing important," Owen replied, shooting his brother a warning look that only made James grin wider. The afternoon mellowed into evening, the heat gradually dissipating as the sun lowered in the western sky. Families with young children began to pack up their belongings, while those who remained gathered for a community sing-along led by Reverend Collins and his surprisingly robust tenor. Owen and Lillian sat slightly apart from the main group, on a blanket spread beneath the oak tree. James had joined the young Miller boys in a game of horseshoes nearby, his deafness no impediment to the physical skill the game required. "It's been a wonderful day," Lillian said, her voice soft as she watched the singing group. "I'm so glad you invited me." "I'm glad you came," Owen replied, acutely aware of how close she sat beside him, their hands nearly touching on the blanket. "It wouldn't have been the same without you." Lillian turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Owen, may I ask you something else personal?" He nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Do you blame yourself for what happened to James?" The question struck like a physical blow, unexpected and painful. Owen looked away, focusing on the distant figures of children playing rather than meet Lillian's gaze. "Yes," he admitted finally. "I do. I encouraged him to come west to join me at the mine." If you hadn't, he might still have lost his hearing some other way," Lillian interrupted gently. "Or he might have faced different hardships on the failing farm, there's no way to know." "But it was my responsibility to protect him," Owen insisted, the guilt that had become his constant companion rising to the surface. "He's my younger brother. Our parents trusted me to look after him." "And you have," Lillian said, her hand finding his on the blanket. "You've sacrificed your own dreams to ensure he could rebuild his life. You've learned to communicate in new ways to adapt to his needs. That is protection, Owen, not preventing harm, which is often beyond our control, but responding to it with love and commitment." Owen stared at their joined hands, emotion tightening his chest. "James doesn't blame me," he said hoarsely. "He's never once suggested it was my fault. Sometimes I think that makes it worse." "Because you can't be forgiven for something no one blames you for," Lillian observed with quiet insight. "You're holding yourself hostage to guilt that serves no purpose, Owen. It doesn't help James, and it certainly doesn't help you." Her words penetrated the armor of self-recrimination that Owen had built around himself since the accident. He looked up to find James watching him from the horseshoe pitch, his expression concerned. Owen managed a smile and a reassuring sign, and James returned to his game, though not without a lingering look that suggested their conversation wasn't over. "I don't know how to let it go," Owen confessed, turning back to Lillian. "It's been part of me for so long." "Perhaps you start by acknowledging that James has found his way forward," Lillian suggested. "That your protection served its purpose during his recovery, but now he needs your partnership more than your guilt." Owen considered this, watching as James celebrated a successful throw with an exuberant gesture that made the Miller boys laugh. His brother had changed. Certainly the carefree young man who had arrived in Red Cloud was gone. But in his place was someone stronger, more determined, with a depth of character that might never have developed without the challenges he'd faced. "He's remarkable, isn't he?" Owen said, pride temporarily displacing guilt. "He is," Lillian agreed. "And so are you, Owen Ingram, more than you realize." The sincerity in her voice made Owen turn to her fully, searching her face for any sign of flattery or pity. He found neither, only warmth and a steadiness that anchored him in the moment. "Lillian," he began, uncertain what he wanted to say but knowing he needed to say something. There you are, Miss Turner." The moment was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Collins, her cheeks flushed from singing and her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but my husband is ready to return to town, and we thought you might want to ride with us rather than walk back in the dark." Lillian hesitated, looking to Owen with a question in her eyes. He wanted nothing more than to offer to drive her himself, to continue their conversation in the privacy of the wagon ride. But James would need transport home as well, and the intimacy of their exchange seemed too fragile to sustain with his brother present. "You should go with them," Owen said reluctantly. "It's getting late." "Yes, I suppose I should," Lillian agreed, though he thought he detected disappointment in her tone. "Thank you for including me today, Owen. It meant a great deal." As she rose to follow Mrs. Collins, Owen caught her hand. "Lillian, would you that is, I was wondering if you might like to have supper with me sometime, just the two of us." The words tumbled out in a rush, almost against his will. Lillian's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a joy that made Owen's heart race. "I would like that very much," she said. "Thursday evening, I'm free after my last lesson." "Thursday," Owen confirmed, reluctant to release her hand but conscious of Mrs. Collins waiting nearby. "I'll call for you at 6. He watched her walk away with the Collinses, her blue dress bright against the darkening grass. When she turned to wave one last time before they reached their wagon, Owen lifted his hand in return, a strange mixture of elation and terror coursing through him. James appeared at his side, signing with exaggerated slowness. "Did you finally ask her to supper?" Owen nodded, unable to keep the smile from his face despite his brother's teasing. "Thursday evening." "Good," James signed emphatically. "Maybe now you'll stop moping around the house like a lovesick calf." "I do not mope," Owen protested, but his indignation lacked conviction. In truth, he had been distracted lately, his thoughts constantly drifting to Lillian when they should have been on farm work or household tasks. James just raised his eyebrows in silent disbelief as they began gathering their belongings to head home. The ride back to the homestead was filled with James's good-natured teasing about Owen's courtship, as he insisted on calling it, and Owen's increasingly feeble denials that it was anything so formal. But as they prepared for bed that night, James's teasing gave way to a more serious conversation. "I'm happy for you," he signed as they sat at the kitchen table, enjoying a final cup of coffee before turning in. "Miss Turner, Lillian is a good woman." "Nothing's certain," Owen cautioned, unwilling to assume too much from a single dinner invitation. James shook his head in exasperation. "You're blind if you don't see how she looks at you," he signed, "and how you look at her. It's obvious to everyone but you." Owen stirred his coffee, considering his brother's words. "Even if you're right and I'm not saying you are, there are complications. She's here temporarily. Her life, her career, they're back east. So ask her to stay permanently," James signed with the simple logic that had always characterized his approach to life. "It's not that easy," Owen protested. "She has family commitments. I can't ask her to give those up for a struggling farmer in Nebraska." James set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "You're not just a farmer, Owen," he signed, his movements slow and emphatic to ensure his brother understood. "You're a man who rebuilt his life and his brother's after tragedy. Who created a home from nothing. Who learned a new language because it was needed. Don't undervalue yourself." The endorsement, coming from the person who had most reason to judge him harshly, left Owen momentarily speechless. "Thank you," he signed finally, the gesture inadequate for the emotion he felt. James nodded, accepting the thanks without further comment. "Just don't ruin Thursday by convincing yourself you're not worthy," he added before standing to rinse his cup. "That would be a waste of a perfectly good supper." The days until Thursday passed with excruciating slowness. Owen found himself planning and replanning the evening, alternating between confidence and doubt about his decision to ask Lillian to dinner. He settled on taking her to the hotel restaurant, the only establishment in Red Cloud that offered something approaching a formal dining experience. On Thursday morning, Owen rode into town earlier than necessary, ostensibly to deliver some produce to the hotel kitchen, but really to ensure their reservation and check that the restaurant was suitable. The hotel manager, amused by Owen's obvious nervousness, assured him that they would have the best table and their finest meal ready for 6:30. "And may I suggest," the manager added with a knowing smile, "that you relax, Mr. Ingram. Miss Turner isn't the type to judge a man by the shine on the silverware." Owen returned to the homestead to complete his chores and prepare for the evening. He bathed meticulously, trimmed his beard, and donned his best suit, the one he had worn to his parents' funeral and had not worn since. It was slightly too tight across the shoulders now, his farm work having broadened his frame, but it was clean and well pressed. James surveyed him critically as he emerged from his bedroom. "You'll do," he signed, though his proud smile belied the casual assessment. "Just remember to breathe occasionally." Owen arrived at Mrs. Barton's boarding house precisely at 6 o'clock, his heart hammering as he knocked on the front door. Mrs. Barton herself answered, eyeing Owen with undisguised interest. "Miss Turner is just finishing her preparations," the older woman informed him, ushering him into the small parlor. "You may wait here. I'm sure she won't be long." The minutes Owen spent in that parlor, surrounded by Mrs. Barton's collection of porcelain figurines and faded daguerreotypes, felt like some of the longest of his life. When he finally heard footsteps on the stairs, he stood so quickly he nearly knocked over a small side table. Lillian appeared in the doorway, and Owen forgot to breathe, just as James had predicted. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. The dress was modest by Eastern standards, he supposed, but to Owen's eyes, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "You look." Owen began, then faltered, unable to find words adequate to the vision before him. "Thank you," Lillian replied with a small smile, saving him from his inarticulateness. "You look very handsome yourself." Mrs. Barton hovered nearby, clearly intending to chaperone their departure, but Lillian skillfully maneuvered past her to take Owen's arm. "We should go, or we'll lose our reservation," she said pleasantly but firmly. "Don't wait up, Mrs. Barton. I may be late returning." The look of scandalized speculation on the landlady's face followed them out the door, causing Lillian to laugh softly once they were safely on the porch. "Mrs. Barton will have us married with 5 children by breakfast tomorrow," she confided as Owen helped her into the waiting wagon. "Would that be so terrible?" The question slipped out before Owen could stop it, far too revealing for a first proper evening together. But Lillian didn't seem taken aback. She simply looked at him thoughtfully as he climbed up beside her. "No," she said softly, "it wouldn't be terrible at all." The hotel restaurant was as good as the manager had promised, their table positioned near a window with a view of the town square, now quiet in the evening hours. The waiter, clearly instructed to provide exemplary service, was attentive without being intrusive. Conversation flowed easily between them as they ate. Lillian spoke of her childhood in Boston, of her sister's illness and recovery, of her decision to become a teacher. Owen shared stories of his own upbringing in Ohio, his journey west with dreams of silver, the early days in Red Cloud before the mine accident changed everything. "I've never told anyone this," Owen admitted as they lingered over dessert, "but sometimes I'm grateful for the accident." Lillian's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Grateful, not for James's injury," Owen clarified quickly. "Never that, but for what it forced me to confront about myself. Before the cave-in, I was obsessed with striking it rich, with proving something to the people back home who thought I'd never amount to anything. I was willing to risk everything, including James, for that goal." He shook his head at the memory of his former self. "The accident showed me what truly mattered: family, home, the kind of man I wanted to be." Lillian reached across the table to touch his hand. "That kind of self-knowledge usually comes at a price," she observed. "You paid it willingly for James's sake." "Any brother would have done the same," Owen demurred. "No, not any brother," Lillian disagreed. "I've seen families torn apart by less. What you did leaving the mine, building a new life, learning to communicate in James's world rather than forcing him to adapt to yours, that was extraordinary, Owen." Owen felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine they had shared with dinner. Lillian truly saw him, not just the rough exterior or the limited education, but the man he had become through hardship and love. "Thank you for saying that," he said simply. As the evening drew to a close, they walked slowly back to Mrs. Barton's boarding house, taking a circuitous route through the quiet streets of Red Cloud. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air cool and fragrant with summer blooms from the gardens they passed. "I don't want this evening to end," Owen confessed as they approached the boarding house, the yellow light from its windows a reminder that their time together was drawing to a close. "Neither do I," Lillian admitted, stopping beneath the spreading branches of an elm tree just short of their destination. "But Mrs. Barton is undoubtedly watching from behind her curtains, ready to protect my reputation." Owen smiled at the image. "She takes her responsibilities seriously." "Too seriously, sometimes," Lillian said with a hint of mischief. "But in this case, perhaps it's for the best. There are things I want to say to you, Owen, but I'm not sure I'm brave enough yet." Owen's heart quickened at her words. "Things?" Lillian nodded, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Important things. Things that might change everything if you feel the same way." "I think I do," Owen said softly, gathering his courage. "Feel the same way, that is." They stood in silence for a moment, the possibility of what they might become to each other hanging between them like a tangible presence. "I should go in," Lillian said finally. Though she made no move to leave, Owen nodded, equally reluctant to end the moment. "When can I see you again?" "I'm free on Sunday afternoon," Lillian offered. "After church." "Sunday, then," Owen agreed. "I'll come for you at 1 o'clock." They had reached the boarding house steps, and Owen knew he should leave her there with a polite goodbye. But something in Lillian's expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty that mirrored his own feelings, made him bold. "Lillian," he said, taking both her hands in his, "I need you to know that this evening has meant more to me than I can express. You have brought light back into my life when I thought the darkness would never lift, and if you'll allow it, I'd like to see where this path between us leads." Lillian's smile was radiant despite the dimness of the porch light. "I would like that too, Owen, very much." For a breathless moment, Owen thought she might allow him to kiss her right there on Mrs. Barton's front porch. But a pointed cough from inside the house broke the spell, and Lillian stepped back with a rueful smile. "Sunday," she repeated, squeezing his hands once before releasing them. "Sunday," Owen confirmed, reluctantly backing down the steps. He watched as she entered the boarding house, closing the door behind her with a final smile in his direction. The walk back to where he had left the wagon was a strange mixture of elation and impatience, joy at what had been shared, eagerness for what might come next. James was still awake when Owen returned home, waiting in the main room with a book open on his lap. He set it aside as Owen entered, his expression expectant. "Well," he signed. "How was it?" Owen couldn't contain his smile. "It was perfect," he signed back. "We're meeting again on Sunday." James's answering grin was wide and knowing. "I told you," he signed smugly. "You just needed to listen with your soul instead of your doubts." The phrase struck Owen forcefully. "What did you say?" he asked aloud, forgetting for a moment that James couldn't hear him. James tilted his head questioningly, and Owen repeated the query in sign. "That phrase, listen with your soul, where did you learn that?" "From Lillian," James signed. "It's something she tells her students who are struggling to adapt to deafness, that they should listen with their souls to what's around them, not just with their ears." Owen sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of the concept. For so long, he had been focused on what James had lost, on the silence that had replaced the sounds of daily life. But in that silence, both of them had learned to perceive the world differently, to read emotions in expressions, intentions in gestures, meaning in the unspoken. "She's right," Owen signed to his brother. "We've both been learning to listen with our souls since the accident. Maybe that's why I feel I understand her better than I've understood anyone in a long time." James nodded, a depth of comprehension in his eyes that belied his youth. "She understands you too," he signed. "I can see it when she looks at you." The days until Sunday passed in a blur of farm work and anticipation. Owen found himself whistling as he tended the crops, planning improvements to the homestead that had previously seemed unnecessary, a flower garden near the porch, perhaps, or a proper sitting room where company could be entertained comfortably. James watched these developments with evident satisfaction, occasionally offering suggestions that revealed he had been thinking along similar lines. The south field would make a good orchard, he signed one evening as they discussed the future of the homestead. Apple trees would do well there. An orchard takes years to establish, Owen pointed out. Yes, James agreed, his expression meaningful. Years will be here, building something worthwhile. The implication was clear. James was planning to stay, to make this place not just a refuge after tragedy but a true home for the future. The realization eased a worry Owen hadn't fully acknowledged, that his brother might want to return east someday, to one of the schools for the deaf where he might find more opportunities. "I'll order saplings in the fall," Owen promised, his vision of the homestead's future expanding to include rows of apple trees, their white blossoms a promise of sweetness to come. Sunday arrived with unexpected rain, a steady downpour that soaked the fields and turned the road to town into a muddy challenge. Owen considered postponing their outing, but the thought of waiting even one more day to see Lillian was unbearable. He arrived at the boarding house promptly at 1, rain dripping from his hat and coat despite his best efforts to stay dry. Mrs. Barton greeted him with evident disapproval, clearly believing that no gentleman would expect a lady to venture out in such weather. "Miss Turner will be down shortly," she said stiffly, once again showing him to the parlor. "Though I've advised her that it would be more sensible to reschedule your excursion." "I understand your concern, Mrs. Barton," Owen replied politely. "But I've brought a covered wagon and plenty of blankets. Miss Turner won't come to any harm in my care." The landlady sniffed skeptically, but left him to wait in peace. When Lillian appeared a few minutes later, her practical dark blue dress and sturdy boots suggesting she had no intention of letting the weather disrupt their plans, Owen felt a surge of admiration for her resilience. "Are you sure you want to go out in this?" he asked nevertheless, gesturing toward the window where rain continued to streak the glass. "We could stay here, though I imagine Mrs. Barton would insist on chaperoning." "She would indeed," Lillian confirmed with a wry smile. "And while I respect her concern for propriety, I've been looking forward to seeing more of your homestead. Unless you'd prefer to postpone?" "Not at all," Owen assured her quickly. "I've prepared for the weather. We'll be perfectly comfortable." The ride to the homestead was slower than usual, the wagon wheels occasionally slipping in the mud, but the rain had slackened to a gentle mist by the time they were halfway there. Beneath the wagon's canvas cover, wrapped in woolen blankets, Lillian seemed content despite the inclement conditions. "There's something peaceful about rain in the country," she observed as they passed fields where droplets glistened on ripening corn. "In the city, it's all hurry and inconvenience. Here it feels like a blessing." "It is a blessing," Owen agreed. "Though ask me again during planting season when it won't stop long enough to get the seeds in the ground, and I might have a different opinion." Lillian laughed, the sound warming Owen more effectively than the blankets. Farmers and their complicated relationship with the weather. "My grandfather was the same way, never satisfied but always grateful." "Was he a farmer? I thought your family were merchants." "My mother's father," Lillian explained. "He had a small farm in Connecticut. I spent summers there as a child, helping with the chickens and the kitchen garden. That's where I learned to love growing things." The revelation of this shared connection to the land deepened Owen's sense that they were meant to find each other. "Would you like to see our garden when we arrive?" James has been experimenting with some Eastern varieties that the general store ordered for him. "I'd love that," Lillian replied warmly. "Though in this weather, perhaps a quick tour followed by tea inside would be best." James was waiting for them when they arrived, his welcome enthusiastic as he ushered them into the house where a fire crackled in the stove and the kettle was already boiling. He had clearly prepared for Lillian's visit, the main room tidier than usual, with a vase of wildflowers on the table despite the season. The afternoon passed in comfortable conversation as the rain continued outside, occasionally drumming harder on the roof before easing again. James shared his designs for the church pulpit, now nearly complete, while Lillian described her plans for expanding the school program to include adults who wanted to learn sign language. The response has been overwhelming, she told them. Not just from families with deaf children, but from people who simply want to be able to communicate with their neighbors. Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, is one of my most dedicated students. Peterson? Owen was surprised. He barely speaks to anyone if he can help it. That's precisely why he's learning to sign, Lillian explained with a smile. He says it's easier for him than talking, less pressure to find the right words. As the daylight began to fade, Owen reluctantly acknowledged that they would need to start back to town soon if they wanted to reach it before dark. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a washed and glistening world outside the windows. "I'll get the wagon ready," James signed, clearly intending to give them a few moments alone. After he had gone, Owen turned to Lillian, who was standing by the window watching the last raindrops fall from the eaves. "I wish you didn't have to go back," he said softly. "It feels right having you here." Lillian turned to face him, her expression serious but warm. "It feels right to me too, Owen, more right than I expected when I came to Red Cloud." The admission gave Owen courage. "Lillian, I need to tell you something. Something I've been feeling since that first day in the schoolhouse, though I didn't recognize it then." She moved closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "Tell me." "I love you," Owen said simply. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you told James his life wasn't over, just changed. Since you showed me that there was a way forward through the guilt and fear that had been my constant companions." Lillian's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "Oh, Owen," she whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I love you too, so much that it frightens me sometimes how quickly and completely you've become essential to my happiness." Owen covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "Then stay," he said, the words a plea and a promise. "Stay in Red Cloud, stay with me. I know it's not Boston or New York, and I know there's so much of the world you've seen that I haven't, but we could build something wonderful here together. Are you asking me to marry you, Owen Ingram?" Lillian asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I am," Owen confirmed, taking both her hands in his. "I'm asking you to share my life, to help me create a home where both of us can pursue our dreams, your teaching, my farming, whatever comes next for us both. And James." Lillian asked gently, "How would he feel about this?" "James has been trying to push me into proposing since the day you arrived for dinner," Owen admitted with a rueful smile. "He adores you, Lillian, and he knows, better than anyone, how much you've changed my life for the better." As if summoned by their discussion, the door opened and James entered, his expression shifting from casual to concerned when he saw their serious faces. "Is everything all right?" he signed. Owen looked to Lillian, who nodded encouragingly. "I just asked Lillian to marry me," he signed to his brother. James's face broke into a wide grin. "Finally," he signed expansively. "What did she say?" Owen realized with a start that in the emotion of the moment, he hadn't actually waited for Lillian's answer. He turned back to her, suddenly anxious. "You haven't said yes," he pointed out. "I haven't, have I?" Lillian agreed, her eyes dancing with a mixture of tears and laughter. "Perhaps because my thoughtful fiancé was so concerned about his brother's opinion that he forgot to wait for my response." "Fiancé," Owen repeated, hope surging through him. "Does that mean yes, Owen?" Lillian said firmly. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will stay in Red Cloud. Yes to all of it." Owen gathered her into his arms then, lifting her slightly off her feet in his exuberance. Behind them, James clapped his hands, unable to hear the sound but clearly feeling the joy of the moment as his own. When Owen finally set Lillian down, she was laughing through her tears, her hands moving to sign to James even as she spoke to Owen. "I think your brother approves." "I knew you were meant for each other," James signed back. "From the first day when you told me to listen with my soul instead of my ears. That's what Owen needed to learn too, to listen to his heart instead of his fears." Owen translated for Lillian, who nodded thoughtfully. "It's a lesson we all need sometimes," she said. to listen beyond the noise of doubt and habit to hear what matters most. The drive back to town that evening was filled with plans and dreams when they would marry as soon as possible, where they would live the homestead with improvements, how they would combine their work. Lillian would continue teaching in town while helping Owen expand the farm. By the time they reached Mrs. Barton's boarding house, the future that had once seemed so uncertain to Owen now stretched before them clear and inviting. "I should come in with you," Owen said as he helped Lillian down from the wagon, "to speak with Mrs. Barton about our engagement." Lillian's laugh was mischievous. "Mrs. Barton will be scandalized that we've decided so quickly, but secretly thrilled to have been proven right about our intentions." And indeed, the landlady's reaction upon hearing their news was a masterpiece of conflicting emotions: disapproval at the hasty nature of the engagement, satisfaction at having predicted it, concern about propriety, and genuine pleasure for Lillian, whom she had come to care for despite their differences in temperament. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order," Mrs. Barton said finally, after expressing all these sentiments in rapid succession. "Though I must say, Miss Turner, I had thought you intended to return east at the end of your assignment." "Plans change, Mrs. Barton," Lillian replied serenely. "Hearts change them." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Red Cloud, meeting with general approval from the community that had come to respect both Owen for his dedication to his brother and Lillian for her contribution to the town's educational needs. Reverend Collins offered to perform the ceremony, suggesting a date in late August before the harvest demands would make a celebration difficult for their farming neighbors. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparation, both for the ceremony itself and for the changes to the homestead that would accommodate a new family member. Owen and James worked tirelessly to add a proper bedroom and sitting room to the small house, while Lillian divided her time between her teaching duties and preparing for her new role as wife and homemaker. Through it all, the bond between them deepened, each day bringing new discoveries about each other and new certainties about their shared future. Owen found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed since the day of the mine collapse, from tragedy to unexpected joy, from isolation to connection, from guilt to grace. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late August Saturday that seemed designed for celebration. The church was filled with well-wishers from town and surrounding farms, many of whom had come to know Lillian through her work with the deaf children, or through James's growing circle of friends. Owen waited at the altar, James at his side as best man, both of them in new suits ordered from back east. When Lillian appeared at the church door, escorted by Reverend Collins in the absence of her own father, Owen felt his heart might burst with happiness. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her auburn hair crowned with a circlet of late summer flowers, her face radiant with joy. The ceremony was conducted in both spoken words and sign language, a testament to the bridge that had been built between worlds once separated by silence. When Owen and Lillian exchanged their vows, they did so aloud and with their hands, a double affirmation of the commitment they were making to each other and to the life they would build together. The celebration afterward, held on the grounds of the church, lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing that included everyone, hearing and deaf alike. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Owen found a moment of quiet with his new wife away from the main festivities. "Are you happy?" he asked, both with words and signs, wanting to be sure she understood the depth of his question. Lillian's answer came in both forms as well, her voice and hands in perfect harmony. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. You've given me not just your love, Owen, but a home and a purpose and a family. What more could I ask?" Later that night, as they lay together in the new bedroom of the homestead, the sounds of the Nebraska night a gentle backdrop to their whispered conversations about the future. Owen reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought them to this moment. From the darkness of the mine collapse to the light of their wedding day, each step had been necessary. Each challenge overcome had led them closer to each other. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked, her head resting on his shoulder, her hair spilling across the pillow in waves of auburn. "About how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best," Owen replied honestly. "If James hadn't lost his hearing, you wouldn't have come to Red Cloud. We might never have met." Lillian was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "I believe some people are meant to find each other," she said finally. "Perhaps not in the way we expect or hope, but in the way we need. You needed someone to help you see beyond guilt and loss. I needed someone to show me that my work had real meaning, that I could build a life around it." "And James?" Owen asked, thinking of his brother sleeping peacefully in his own room across the hall, his future now filled with possibilities none of them had imagined a year ago. "James needed both of us," Lillian said simply. "To believe in him, to support him without limiting him. To listen with our souls to what he needed, not what we thought he should want." The phrase that had become so meaningful to them all echoed in Owen's mind as he drifted toward sleep, his wife cradled in his arms, their future stretching before them like the vast Nebraska sky, boundless, full of light, and rich with promise. In the years that followed, the Ingram homestead grew and prospered. The apple orchard James had suggested took root and flourished, producing its first modest crop 3 years after the wedding. The house expanded again with the arrival of children, first a son they named Matthew, who inherited his father's steady nature and his mother's love of learning, and then twin girls, Sarah and Emily, whose energy and curiosity kept the household in constant motion. James remained with them, building a small cabin of his own on the property as the family grew, but always part of their daily lives. His work with the church led to broader opportunities, designing buildings in neighboring towns, teaching carpentry to deaf students who traveled to learn from him, eventually publishing a book of architectural drawings specifically adapted for builders with hearing impairments. Lillian continued her teaching, establishing a permanent school for the deaf in Red Cloud that drew students from across the territory. As her reputation grew, so did the school, eventually requiring a proper building of its own and additional teachers trained in the methods she had pioneered in the West. Owen divided his time between the expanding farm and supporting Lillian's educational work, finding in this balance a fulfillment he had never imagined when he first came west seeking silver. The wealth he had dreamed of discovering in the mines came instead from the fertile soil, the changing seasons, and the family that gathered around their table each evening, a family bound together not just by blood or marriage, but by the deeper connections they had forged through adversity and love. On the 10th anniversary of the mine collapse, Owen stood at the edge of the apple orchard, watching as his children played among the trees now heavy with ripening fruit. James was with them, teaching Matthew how to test apples for ripeness while the twins darted between the rows, their laughter carrying on the late summer breeze. Lillian joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of a decade shared. "They're planning to pick enough for pies," she informed him with a smile. "James has promised to help them if you'll build a fire in the outdoor oven." Owen nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "It's been 10 years today," he said, knowing she would understand the reference without elaboration. "I know," Lillian replied, her expression softening. "I've been thinking about it too, about how far we've all come since then." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as James demonstrated to the children the correct way to twist an apple from its stem, his hands moving in the graceful language that had become second nature to the entire family. Even the twins, not yet 6 years old, were fluent in both spoken English and sign, moving effortlessly between worlds that Owen had once thought irreconcilably separated. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if things had been different?" Owen asked, the question one he rarely allowed himself to consider. If the mine hadn't collapsed, if James hadn't lost his hearing, Lillian turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the wisdom that had drawn him to her from the beginning. I think about it sometimes, she admitted. But then I look at our life now, at our children, at James's work, at the school, at what we've built together, and I can't wish for anything to be different. Even the hardest parts led us here. Owen nodded, understanding completely what she meant. The guilt he had carried for so long had gradually transformed over the years into a deep appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit, James's spirit, certainly, but also his own and Lillian's, and now their children's as they faced their own small challenges and triumphs. "Listen," Lillian said suddenly, her head tilted slightly. Owen listened to the rustling of the apple leaves, to the distant calls of birds preparing for their autumn journey south, to the laughter of their children and the occasional thump of ripe fruit falling to the ground. But he also listened with that inner sense that James had taught him to develop, that awareness that went beyond physical sound to the deeper currents of meaning and connection. "I hear it," he said softly, drawing Lillian into his arms. "All of it, the life we've made. The love that brought us here." She smiled up at him, her face as dear and familiar to him now as his own reflection, yet still capable of taking his breath away with its beauty. "Then we've both learned the most important lesson," she said, "to listen with our souls to what matters most." As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the orchard and turning the ripening apples to globes of gold, Owen felt a sense of completion that transcended mere happiness. This was joy in its purest form, not the absence of hardship or the fulfillment of easy dreams, but the rich, complex satisfaction of a life fully lived, challenges faced, love freely given and returned in equal measure. From the orchard came James's distinctive whistle, sharp and clear, his signal that it was time to gather for the apple picking. The children responded immediately, running toward their uncle with baskets swinging from their hands, eager for the promised pies and the stories that would accompany their work. "We should join them," Lillian said, though she made no move to leave the circle of Owen's arms. "They'll be wondering where we are in a minute," Owen replied, bending to kiss her with the unhurried tenderness of a man who knows the value of such moments. "Some things are worth savoring." It was, he reflected as Matthew ran to meet them, his small face alight with the simple joy of family and purpose, exactly as Lillian had said on their wedding night. Some people were meant to find each other, not in the way they expected, but in the way they needed. And sometimes, the most important discoveries came not from the silver hidden in the earth, but from learning to truly listen with the soul.